on several occasions. Thank you, Bidit, for the opportunity. I think this came along about 2 months ago when David Damtik and I were having a discussion about second doses. And as a result of that, I very quickly, a couple of days later, got an invitation from Bidit to update the talk that I'd given on November the 18th of last year. Today, I plan on providing a little bit of an update on what's happened to the pandemic, both worldwide as well as Ontario. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about treatment updates, which have received very little attention, talk a lot about vaccines, variants, the vaccine rollout, and make some predictions for our future. Now, during this presentation, at times you will sense some negativity and depression from me. But ultimately, I'm hoping that we can focus on the positives, especially on lessons that have been learned from other jurisdictions and from the errors that we've been making ourselves. And I hope to end with some cautious optimism for the future. Now, first of all, this is an update from exactly 3 months after my November the 18th lecture, just to show that things have not gotten any better in the world. This is deaths per million population, and I've selected a variety of countries for a variety of reasons. Belgium, always at the very top. Our neighbors to the south, you can see that virtually every jurisdiction has at least doubled the deaths per million in that 3-month period of time. And even Estonia has more than doubled. It's gone from 61 deaths per million to currently 384 deaths per million. The only exception to that is the island of New Zealand, which is the only major civilized country that's maintained stability during this period of time. Remember that we were talking about the dangers of a second wave and lessons learned from 1918. And indeed, the Canadian second wave exceeded the deaths in the first wave by January the 22nd of this year, less than 1 year after the first case occurred. The anniversary of that first case was January the 25th of this year. That first case in Canada came to my hospital, Sunnybrook. The patient was admitted for 7 days for observation, recovered completely successfully, and since then, only 4,000 additional patients have gone through Sunnybrook's doors. Overall in Canada, during that 1-year anniversary period, almost 750,000 cases, and at that time, 19,000 deaths. In Ontario, on that same anniversary, over 250,000 cases, or almost 2% of the Ontario population had been infected, 5,638 deaths related to COVID, but a fatality rate that has remained remarkably stable throughout the world at about 2.2%. Now, this slide is deliberately intended not to scare you. It provides an update from Dr. Rob Fowler, an intensive care specialist at Sunnybrook, who a couple of weeks ago provided us through Grand Rounds with an update of treatments. The only purpose of this slide is to indicate that behind the scenes, a whole host of different strategies are being investigated here and now to try to determine what treatments might be offered for patients who are suffering from COVID-19 infection. And as a very brief summary, there's no doubt whatsoever that the role of dexamethasone, a very inexpensive, widely used corticosteroid, is paramount in the treatment of severely ill individuals with COVID. There is much less enthusiasm over the last several months with the antiviral remdesivir, and increasing interest in using anticoagulation, especially for people who are very unwell, because this particular condition has a very strong propensity to clot formation or thrombosis. On a sad note, the efforts to use convalescent plasma around the world have really proven to be very unfruitful. In Toronto, there are early clinical trials led by Jordan Feld at the University of Toronto using PEG interferon lambda. It's been proposed to be used very early after exposure because it has a direct antiviral effect and it allows for faster clearance of virus. Where this will fit into the overall spectrum of treatment remains to be seen. And finally, an interesting update about Eli Lilly's product, bamlanivimab. Bamlanivimab is a monoclonal antibody. It's given intravenously at $1,500 per injection. It actually tries to block virus entry into cells. In British Columbia, starting this month, they will be undertaking a study using bamlanivimab for the early stages of infection. It potentially could be used for long-term care facilities prior to vaccination, but now that vaccines are more likely available, one of the purported uses for bamlanivimab will be for prophylaxis for those people who either refuse to or cannot tolerate vaccination. Now, I want to talk a little bit about public health measures. And I know that most Estonians have some affinity to Sweden because that's where many of you or your ancestors would have emigrated from or escaped from Estonia after the Second World War. And Sweden was relatively famous for its very different approach to COVID-19. It did not have a lockdown. Its restaurants and gyms remained open. Its stores were open. There was no mandate to wear masks, no social distancing. And they were in fact trying to create herd immunity by infection, not vaccination. It was kind of living with nature approach. Now, the simple reality is that lots of Swedes may have been happy, except for the friends and family of the 13,000 Swedes that died. And if you compare that, the Swedish population of 10 million to Ontario's population of 14 million, you'll see that that death rate is actually very significant and an unqualified condemnation of the Swedes' lackadaisical approach to public health measures. Now, I'm getting a little bit political here with apologies, but I'm going to characterize Ontario's public health approach as muddling as opposed to modeling. Muddling is the situation in which you wait for last-minute data and ultimately act too late. Modeling, on the other hand, is understanding and respecting epidemiologic modeling data, which ultimately asks you to act weeks earlier. Now, I wanted to read to you a historic quote, which I came upon over the last couple of months, which I thought was really quite compelling. And I'll read this verbatim. When the situation was manageable, it was neglected. And now that it is thoroughly out of hand, we apply too late the remedies which then may have effected a cure. It falls into that long, dismal catalog of the fruitlessness of experience and the confirmed unteachability of mankind. Want of foresight, unwillingness to act when action would be simple and effective, lack of clear thinking, confusion of counsel until emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history. This quote came from Winston Churchill in 1935 while he was a member of parliament in opposition regarding various Britain's failed policies toward Nazi Germany. And it is uncannily characteristic of what we've seen, unfortunately, in Ontario over the course of the last several months. Now, a classic example of muddling versus modeling occurred on the December 18th, 2020 decision to delay the further lockdown of the province until the day after Christmas. More holiday shopping outside Toronto and Peel, and this was done despite the desperate pleas of hospitals and physicians to start the lockdown immediately, not a week and a couple of days later. And as a result of that, what was termed the single consequential week occurred. Subsequent cell phone mobility data during that week before Christmas showed that at least 105,000 people from Toronto, Peel, and York that were fully locked down traveled to the Halton and Hamilton regions to 5 specific shopping malls to do their Christmas shopping. And as a result of that, if we look at that period of time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks after that decision, as a result of that consequential week, there were over 65,000 COVID cases, 1,307 deaths, and at that point, at one point, there were 402 COVID ICU admissions in this province. Then, of course, came lockdown 2 on January the 13th. And here the Premier is talking about dark days ahead, turbulent waters, a health system on the brink of collapse, but yet we're still going to start 48 hours later to implement the stay-at-home order, the closure of so-called non-essential workplaces, while at the same time, big box stores were fully open. Now, I want to take a little bit of time talking about ICU beds, because many of you will appreciate that this has always been a big concern for the physicians in the audience. In Ontario, we have something over 2,000 ICU beds, of which about a fifth of them, 407, are in Toronto. It's important to realize that before COVID hit, 90% of ICU beds tend to be occupied. They're occupied by trauma, and especially they're occupied by major cardiac and cancer surgeries. A COVID patient, when occupying a bed, typically stays 3 times longer than any other patient. And when you have 420 beds occupied, you are basically depriving 420 times 3 patients of trauma, major cardiac and cancer surgery. The picture on the right of the slide is Rosine Chouinard-Chavot, who 10 days ago died in Montreal as a result of not being able to get surgery that would have required an ICU stay. Now, fortunately, the pleadings of major public health authorities like Elaine Davila for a lockdown to continue until March the 9th, next week, were heeded. And so there is at least some ray of thumbs up optimism for the way in which our government can occasionally listen to the experts to deal with the public health measures. Now, next, I wanted to talk a little bit about vaccines and some very brief history. In 1796 in England, Dr. Edward Jenner took pus from patients who had the relatively mild disease of cowpox, scratched it onto patients to prevent smallpox, which indeed itself was and remains a very fatal condition. And it was from the fact that cowpox was the origin of the vaccinations to prevent smallpox that the Latin word vacca for cow has given us the name vaccine. Now, a bit of science history for vaccines. A lot of attention has been focused on messenger RNA. And initially it was portrayed as being something terribly new and revolutionary. It in fact has been studied for over 2 decades. And mRNA research into vaccination started really to receive prominence in 2003 with SARS. It continued with the Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2012, and with the Zika virus in 2016. You may remember Zika having a dramatic effect on the Rio Olympic Games. mRNA instructs cells to make a harmless piece of the spike protein of the coronavirus. Then our immune system creates antibodies, B cells, T cells, and natural killer or NK cells. This composes the totality of the immune response. And this mRNA approach, which is really important, allows more rapid updates of future vaccines, which we'll talk about. Now, here's a brief vaccine comparison. mRNA vaccines, and I'll go into the details of these a little bit more, are of course the Pfizer Moderna products. They have high efficacy. They're very costly, except for a discount that was offered to South Africa and a premium that was paid in Israel. The adenovirus vaccines, Johnson & Johnson's AstraZeneca, also have high efficacy, but have a substantially lower cost. And the attenuated virus vaccines from China and India have undetermined efficacy, and we have no information about their costs. Now, this was a slide that I presented in November, and you'll recall that by that time, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer were in phase 3 clinical trials, and all of them have now met approval. But as we suggested at that time, there are winners and losers, and some of the major losers amongst major international global pharmaceutical countries included Merck, which abandoned its 2 trials earlier this year, and Sanofi, which gave up on its attempts. So this is a brief review of the major vaccines that are currently in play. The Pfizer product, 90 to 95% efficacy, and the real world effectiveness is now reported to be similar even with new variants. As all of you probably have heard, 2 doses per patient, allegedly 3 weeks apart. And Sanofi, whose own product failed, is now assisting Pfizer with the production of its vaccine. Canada purchased 20 million doses for some time this year. The Pfizer product was notorious for initial storage requirements at minus 70 degrees. It's then thawed to room temperature, at which point it's stable for 5 days. It's then before injection mixed with sodium chloride, and then it requires use within 6 hours. What's interesting is that on February the 19th, Pfizer actually applied to the regulators that its product can now be stored at more reasonable, higher temperatures. The Moderna vaccine also has very high efficacy. Its real-world effectiveness has not yet been formally determined. Again, it's a 2-dose vaccine 4 weeks apart, and Moderna is already studying a booster for the South Africa variant. It requires storage at a more reasonable minus 20 degrees, and Canada has significant purchase orders. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine had an initial study cohort of only 12,000 individuals, and they were aged 18 to 55. And this becomes very relevant for our Ontario situation. It's again a 2-dose vaccine, and the initial trials were actually conducted in the UK, South Africa, and Brazil, and showed about 71% efficacy. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is much cheaper to produce, much easier to transport. It requires only regular refrigerator temperature, and expected to have a very large role in the poorer nations of the world for those reasons, in addition to its cost. It has, however, been rejected by South Africa and Switzerland because they don't believe it's going to be effective enough for their populations. Now, Health Canada approved the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine last week, and we have 20 million doses that are due. Health Canada proved it based on their studies at a 62.1% efficacy, which is of course raising concerns in the general public. However, it is important to note that those patients who got the AstraZeneca vaccine and who got infected did not have any kind of severe hospital requiring or fatal disease. It's only been approved in Germany, Sweden, and Norway, and now very recently in Canada, for ages 18 to 64, so not applicable to the senior population. The Janssen and Johnson & Johnson vaccine with 86% efficacy was approved by the US FDA in February, and Health Canada approval is expected for March of 2021. Merck, again, a failed producer of its own vaccine, is now helping Johnson & Johnson with production in the United States. The real world effectiveness of this has not yet been determined, but what's very interesting about the Johnson & Johnson product is that it is a single dose vaccine requiring only normal refrigeration, and Canada putatively has agreements for well more than the population that it's supposed to serve. Sanofi GlaxoSmithKline had a poor response to older adults, and although it began new trials, it is again currently helping Pfizer with its vaccine production, showing a rather unusual collaboration between major pharmaceutical competitors, given the seriousness of the pandemic, and also, of course, the financial opportunities for these companies. Now, in Canada, we still have a couple of products in trials. The Novavax vaccine based out of Maryland, which, if successful, is going to be actually manufactured in Montreal starting in late 2021. And the Medicago vaccine from Quebec, for which we have agreements, but trials for that are yet published. This becomes important because you may be aware that Canada did not have its own vaccination production capacity until these last efforts. And 2 other efforts in terms of assisting Canada become vaccine independent are occurring at the University of Saskatchewan, where their product is entering clinical trials. Fortunately, no need for ultra cold storage, results expected later this year, and a more recent entry into the game, Providence Therapeutics based out of Calgary, using mRNA technology. Phase 1 trials have started, phase 2 is expected in May, and results expected early 2020. Although these do not have an immediate impact, they certainly will have a role in the longer term for revaccinating the population. So in summary, the vaccine in Canada has seen well over $1 billion of our tax dollars spent, including important things like vials and syringes, and including the special 6-dose syringes that are required for the Pfizer COVID vaccination to make sure that you're able to maximize the number of doses given per vial. Now, I also wanted to spend a little bit of time with the non-traditional vaccines, and I'll start with the Sinopharm China vaccine, approved at late December of 2020, allegedly with 70% efficacy. The Chinese apparently were supposed to vaccinate only 50 million of their population in February. As we talked about earlier, it's promising to share with the world what the EU characterizes the so-called politics of generosity. And this is a partial list of the countries that are now using the Sinopharm vaccine. The Emirates, Indonesia, Egypt, Brazil, Serbia, the EU country of Hungary. And in fact, the Hungarian Prime Minister just recently was vaccinated with the Chinese product, Turkey, Zimbabwe, Palestine, and a total of 53 other countries. This is really getting into an area of sort of the geopolitics of vaccines, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I wanted to bring this to your attention. There are some quality concerns with the Sinopharm vaccine. In real-world effectiveness studies, the results from Turkey were very encouraging, Indonesia not so much, and in Brazil, it was only shown to have 51% efficacy. Again, I remember that the trial data has not been published for the Sinopharm product. Next, we turn to Sputnik V, the Russian vaccine. September of 2020, during the time of my last presentation, they presented essentially in a phase 3 trial with 20,000 people in the trial. Its efficacy is reported in The Lancet as 91%. The Lancet is one of the premier medical journals in the world, and I must say, without having read the study myself, that it's very likely that the Lancet editorial board reviewing this felt that the data presented by the Russians was pretty compelling. The Russians are supplying 39 countries, including Mexico, Palestine, Iran, Serbia, and 2 EU countries, Hungary and Slovakia. And of course, the Hungarian presence in these 2 non-EU country trials is a result of the slow turnout of EU vaccinations and approvals, and they've just been too anxious and have gone off by themselves to secure vaccine. Now I want to turn to the second dose debate. Delaying the second dose actually started early in January, when experts wanted to curb what was appearing to be a very rampant spread of the virus and in anticipation of the supply challenges that actually came. And in essence, delaying the second dose would enable twice the number of individuals to get at least 1 dose. And this approach was adopted very early on by Quebec, by Saskatchewan, by New Brunswick, by British Columbia, by the United Kingdom, by Estonia, and as of a couple of hours ago, by Ontario today. The pluses of the second dose debate: twice the number of people getting some protection early on. The delay of the second dose is likely not to be detrimental, and of course, pending more robust supplies. And on January the 13th, this approach was actually formally endorsed by the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, and that second dose delay was now suggested to be up to 42 days. On the negative side, there were some experts that said, listen, we really need to be giving all vaccinations according to the official specs of the manufacturer. And of course, both manufacturers wanted to be given as they specified. There are some financial interests that might be involved in this, and their data initially seemed to suggest that the first dose confers 50% effectiveness and a limited trial data on the delayed dose. As you'll see in the next slide, that 50% effectiveness was actually a misinterpretation of their own data. Because on February the 17th in the New England Journal, Danuta Skorowski and Gaston Dezeres, Danuta from British Columbia and Gaston from Quebec, made a very compelling argument in the New England Journal of Medicine that 1 dose of the Pfizer vaccine is enough for now, And she actually mentioned this to the federal government and to the NACI back in December. Her interpretation of the Pfizer data suggested that the first dose shows 92% effectiveness after 2 weeks. And as a result of that, and by the way, for those of you who aren't physicians, the New England Journal of Medicine, despite the fact that it seems like a little sort of a neighborhood magazine, is in fact the world's most prestigious and well-regarded medical journal. The implication of Danuta and Gaston's work is that there will be a faster rollout, especially if there are situations where vaccine supplies are limited, because twice the number of people can be vaccinated promptly. And in fact, to add more to this particular story, starting last month, the United Kingdom started doing studies of 2 different vaccines mixed up. In other words, you might get AstraZeneca for your first dose and maybe Moderna or something else for your second dose. So those studies, of course, are well under the way, no results yet for that particular phenomenon. Now, all vaccines do have allergic reactions. And within the first day, there were 2 early cases in the United Kingdom. Both nurses had a history of severe allergies, and both of them, fortunately, had their own EpiPens with them. In the United States, there was tremendous media attention when one nurse had a vasovagal attack or a fainting attack. And ironically, in San Diego, there was a batch of Moderna vaccine that seemed to cause more allergic reactions. But at least in the mainstream media, there's been very little additional information about serious allergic reactions. In Ontario, after the first 280,000 vaccinations, only 83 patients had allergic reactions. Only 1 required medication and none were hospitalized. And the current advice, very simply, is to avoid the vaccine if one has a history of allergic reactions. Adverse effects are expected to occur: tenderness at the site, pain at the site, fatigue, headache, muscle aches, and chills, more likely after the second dose and less likely if older than 64, only because elderly patients may have a delayed or a weaker immune response. But all of these adverse effects, in fact, ironically, are an indication of the fact that your body is mounting an immune response. There's an unusual complication called COVID arm, where a red raised lesion occurs at the injection site about 5 days after the injection. It usually subsides within the next 5 days. It's managed with anti-inflammatory medications if needed. And again, this is an indication of a proper immune response. I'm going to turn now to discuss the variants. And it's important to understand that the variants are picked up by very specialized viral genome testing. The United Kingdom, to their credit, since the very beginning of the pandemic, always analyzed 10% of its COVID-19 samples for genome abnormalities. In Denmark, that number was 50%. In Canada, before the variants came to be, we were only looking at between 1% and 5% of COVID samples. British Columbia is now wishing to do 15% of samples, and Ontario is aiming for 10% per day of samples having the specialized viral genomic testing. Now, the Chinese variant, so to speak, is the first one, and it is typically called variant G or germline. Both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines were created against it. The very famous now UK variant came about largely because the UK was looking for it. And it was first diagnosed in September of 2020. It is called officially B.1.1.7, and it presumably came from an immunocompromised person. It began circulating widely in the United Kingdom in November of 2020 and has a reproductive value over 1, which means that it's much more highly transmissible. It's easier to spread. It is felt to be structurally stickier, but it does not cause more serious illness. And both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines have been proven to be effective against the UK variant. Since Christmas, the UK typically has had well over 50,000 cases per day, and probably now close to half of its cases are the UK variant. The South African variant, B.1.351, was detected in October, and the first case in Ontario occurred just last month. It is now the dominant strain in South Africa. It's had a little bit less spread worldwide because there typically is less travel from South America or South Africa. It's not a more severe disease, but again, more easily transmissible. And a recent New England Journal of Medicine article showed that both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were effective for it, but Moderna is actually going out of its way to study a booster dose after something like 6 to 12 months for the South Africa variant. The AstraZeneca product has very poor effectiveness, and as I mentioned earlier, South Africa has actually asked for a refund for their AstraZeneca vaccines. The Brazilian variant is named P1. It was detected again in the summer of last year, and our first case occurred in February. It has spike protein alterations similar to the UK and South African variants. It is, again, more transmissible, and there is concern about vaccine effectiveness for the Brazilian variant. Another variant that you may hear about in the future is the California variant, B1429. Detected again in the summer of 2020 and now affects 44% of the cases in Southern California. It's also now been detected in Northern California and 19 other American states. Again, same theme, more transmissible with a doubling of the viral load in patients who are infected. You may have remembered from March the Danish variant, L452R, which affected millions of domestic farm mink who had to be destroyed as a result of this variant. Fortunately, only 12 humans were infected. To the best of my knowledge, none died. And it's really more of a historic and for animal lovers, very sad remembrance of the fact that we can have viruses also affecting animals. And the next variants. Just last week, B1526, the New York variant, was reported. Again, more transmissible. And the last three lines on this slide just remind us that we're going to be seeing the next one. And after that, there will be another next one. And after that, there will be another next one. And ultimately, that's going to require more regular revaccination. And it will be a challenge to maintain so-called herd immunity that I'll talk about shortly. So that on February the 7th, just less than a month ago, all three major variants, what are now loosely called the variants of concern, the UK variant, the South Africa variant, and the Brazil variant, were and are present in Ontario. They are highly transmissible, and it is the major cause or concern for the third wave, as you can see from these various headlines. Now, you may have heard in the early days that the patient who came down with one of these variants had no apparent contact. And this slide is simply a reminder that somebody could have come from Brazil or South Africa or the UK, landed in Canada, interacted with dozens of people in between, and some patient well down the interaction line ended up getting sick, ended up being hospitalized. So don't be put off by the claim that there is no apparent contact for the ultimate patient on the bottom right from somebody who may have been traveling from some other place where there was a variant of concern, including New York State, as I just mentioned a couple of slides ago. Now, this is a busy slide, but it really tries to capture the most important issues related to the potential third wave. We cannot do very much about the increased numbers of variants with their increased transmission. We hope that our government will help us with expeditious and speedy vaccine rollout. But what we can do, what the us in that star can do, is to maintain masking, maintain social distancing, and follow all public health control measures so that we can do our part in this particular triad to try to avoid the very real threat of the third wave. Now switching gears a little bit to talk about the vaccine rollout. Now, many of you will have remembered slides like this from early January, showing that the premium price paid by Israel for the Pfizer vaccine was putting them well ahead of doses that were being given to their 100 people population in comparison to Canada, which typically was well down the list. Here's an update from yesterday's data. Israel now has vaccinated almost 100% of its population and continues with a world ranking of #1. The United Kingdom has done remarkably well at 31.4% of their population. The United States, almost a quarter of their population, largely, I think, due to the new administration. Estonia ranks 23rd in the world at 8.8%, Germany 7.9%, and Canada at 5.3% of its population currently ranks 41st in the world in terms of vaccine doses given per 100 people. Now, this slide is from me, and I think it's a very simple explanation of the fact that at times of large demand and limited resource, prioritization is critical. This slide, which I will not go into any detail, is the ethical framework for COVID vaccination distribution. And if you want to have a depressing document to read, this is one, because it essentially takes many, many words to offer really not very much advice at all. It is unfortunately relatively nebulous, simplistic, and really does not give any kind of proper direction in terms of how we should be prioritizing, even based on ethical principles. So I've listed the next couple of slides as my version of prioritization 101. In order to prioritize properly, one has to determine the priorities very specifically and in detail. It is not useful to use ill-defined, self-definable words such as frontline, patient-facing, or especially the essential worker or caregiver concept, because that is too broad a definition to use when you have limited resources and you really have to create a proper list of recipients in each priority. Prioritization 101 would also suggest that things like the 5-page consent form be available in advance. And in the upper right is the first section of the Ministry of Health vaccine screening consent form that you will be asked to fill out, usually at the site of vaccination instead of in advance. It is available online, but it is currently not part of the appointment creating process. Furthermore, a central authority needs to distribute the accurate amount of vaccine to local sites for administration. Those administrations should occur strictly by list, and if there is an oversupply, such as no-shows, to have a backup list so that the vaccination can occur to those who are next on the priority list. It seems simple enough, but it has been very difficult to actually perform properly. We've also seen various headlines about the fact that weekend activity was slower. Experts urge clarity on vaccination priority. And so let's review a little bit the vaccine rollout in Ontario. It started in mid-December, and the first doses were given at the University Health Network to 5 individuals, 4 of whom were personal support workers from the nearby Reckeye Center and their executive non-patient-facing director. It's possible that she was requested to have the vaccine to serve as a role model for other staff who may have been hesitant at the Reckeye Center to receive the vaccine. And that same group of individuals, well covered by the photographers of the day, received their second dose exactly 3 weeks later. If we look at the Israeli rollout, and we're going to come back to Israel on several occasions, Israel made a commitment to vaccinate its entire 6.5 million adult population quickly. A first dose has been given to everyone, but they are typically taking the delayed second approach, as we talked about earlier. There is concern in Israel about vaccine hesitancy, especially amongst 2 groups, the ultra-Orthodox and the youth. Israel is fortunate to have an integrated, digitized healthcare system. It employs multiple clinics functioning 24 hours per day in a relatively small geographic area. And those are some of the factors that have caused it to reach virtually 100% of its rollout within the first couple of months. And as I mentioned before, Israel has an agreement with Pfizer. They paid a premium price, $31 per dose, for an abundant immediate supply. And Israel will provide real-world data to Pfizer to better understand the concept of herd immunity, as well as, by the way, issues related to vaccine hesitancy. Now, in Estonia, The first 5,000 Pfizer doses were distributed to physicians and their office staff, and the next 10,000 doses to 10,000 new individuals, that is spreading the first dose around. And the future priorities, not unexpectedly, will be to the elderly by age cohort, starting with those over 80, as well as those individuals who are medically vulnerable or immunocompromised. We have, of course, had supply challenges, including things like making sure that we had the right 6 dose per vial syringes. And I will not spend any time on the COVAX controversy other than sharing this cartoon showing the Canadian beaver with its $220 million contribution, now apparently seeking to be third in line amongst the 140 poorer nations in the world. Now, to be on the positive side, Canada has had some vaccine successes. We have not needed politicians to set an example. Unlike the United States, where Biden, Harris, and Pence, and especially Trump secretly in early January, had to set an example by rolling up their sleeve and getting the vaccine. In the United Kingdom, we're well aware that Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip also were setting an example. We fortunately in Canada haven't had to have our politicians doing that. In addition, there were earlier contraindications to giving the vaccines to pregnant breastfeeding patients, as well as patients who are immunosuppressed or with autoimmune disease. And there has been a relatively prompt reversal of those earlier contraindications. Thumbs up to those successes. Now we talk about the rollout. And as this cartoon illustrates one of the potential 2021 words of the year, the rollout, unfortunately to date, has been full of blunder, failure, and a huge disappointment in Ontario. And I wanted to characterize 2 of what I call the vaccine rollout fumbles, for long-term care residents and for the general principle of prioritization. Now, many of you will remember that the Ontario government promised the so-called iron ring around long-term care residents when the first wave of COVID-19 was disproportionately affecting those individuals. Ontario, unlike Quebec, was unable to increase the staffing, especially for personal support workers. In Quebec, by the way, almost 10,000 new personal support workers were recruited over the course of the summer. So that meant that in Ontario, vaccination was the key. There were just over 70,000 long-term care residents in Ontario. And as Nathan Stahl from Mount Sinai has reported, if the first dose of vaccine had been offered, all 70,900 long-term care residents could have been vaccinated by December the 31st of 2020, because by that time, Ontario had already given more than 100,000 doses. So if we look at that period of time, 2 weeks after the potential last date of vaccination, since January the 15th of 2021, there have been 720 COVID deaths in long-term care. And even if we assumed only a very modest 50% vaccine effectiveness, 360 long-term care residents' lives were not saved as a result of Ontario government's policy of failing to provide the so-called iron ring to our long-term care residents. The classic example, regrettably, of this was Roberta Place in Barrie, a January 8th outbreak where all 129 residents were affected, including 84 staff, and 71 of the 129 residents died, as well as 1 of the 84 staff. And this, of course, was the prototypic example of UK variant B117, the highly transmissible variant. Next, we talk about prioritization failures. Frontline healthcare providers, however that may have been defined, were supposed to get the vaccine first. But this didn't occur at Leamington, at Michael Garron in Toronto, or at the University Health Network. The vaccines were provided to non-priority staff and garnered significant media attention. The UHN public relations staff got the vaccine. There were researchers not working with COVID that got the vaccine. And the CEO's comments talked about the fact that, yes, their system was imperfect, they valued speed, not precision, and they relied on an honor system. And fortunately, this derived a fair amount of media attention. Hospital draws fire for use of vaccine surplus. And during an internal town hall meeting, which was ultimately on YouTube, they revealed a lot of significant pushback over the apparent lack of vaccine priorities. This front page cutout was actually relating to the chief of geriatrics at Mount Sinai, who, despite the fact that he was a front care provider, really had a sting of conscience, to use his words, about receiving the vaccine before all long-term care patients in Ontario would have received the vaccine. Queue jumping has been well reported. One of the more interesting examples was from Headwaters Hospital in Orangeville, where on January the 20th of this year, a director was fired, essentially asked to resign, because she provided vaccine for a queue jumping relative. At the same hospital, 2 weeks later, an emergency manager arranged for her 19-year-old son to get the second dose of vaccine along with the first dose. We don't know exactly what repercussions she experienced. Same hospital, 2 weeks apart. There have been numerous other examples, most recently the Canada Pension Plan CEO resigning after getting his vaccination in Dubai, and a very famous example from Woodbridge, where a nursing home manager was able to get multiple samples of the vaccine to various friends and family members. Estonia was also affected by queue jumping. I've been told by colleagues that a senior hospital physician in southern Estonia offered vaccine to members of his non-medical social group, and he was fired. In Narva, Estonia, in the northeast, the physician offered vaccines to a Russian official. We have no information about what happened with that particular person. It was an international phenomenon. In January of this particular year, Spain's top general resigned because he accepted vaccine as a queue jumper. Prioritization failures, as would be expected, were also prevalent in the United States. The Center for Disease Control guidelines prioritized, again, frontline healthcare workers. Yet there were multiple examples of hospitals' major donors, often with a donation limit of as little as $10,000, getting early vaccine access. The state of Florida decided to include all 65-year-olds and older. Governor DeSantis, a Republican, said this is the greatest generation of Americans and they should all deserve the vaccine, irrespective of whether they were a healthcare worker or not. This caused long lineups. And indeed, what happened in Florida, tourists, especially from South America and Canada, were eligible as long as they paid for it. This displaced a lot of prioritized Americans. There was significant media backlash. And as of January the 21st, individuals now must show residency documents in order to be eligible for vaccine, which they, of course, still have to pay for. We've had very little data on vaccine update. Last week, there were reports that in Ontario long-term care facilities, the staff update of vaccine has only been 55% in comparison to the residents' uptake of 96%. There are a variety of vaccine so-called hesitancy factors. Distrust of government, especially amongst the First Nations communities, racialized communities, due to vaccine misinformation, conspiracy theories, vaccine safety due to Operation Warp Speed, and a lot of people believing that the vaccine was developed too quickly. It couldn't be true. And of course, concerns about the estimates or overestimates of side effects. The Israeli experience, fortunately, suggests that hesitancy decreases as more people, especially family, friends, and neighbors, get vaccinated. So that's a bit of good news. Vaccine hesitancy factors also have logistic issues. They were offered away from the workplace for many at inconvenient hours for workers that were able to obtain childcare. Appointments were often offered only online, or the online systems were unable to handle the volumes. And for workers who were concerned about side effects, the absence of paid sick leave. Now, the next phase of rollouts, of course, in Ontario has begun. Deloitte has been hired as a consultant, and as you're hopefully well aware, community center clinics, pharmacies, mobile clinics, and even potentially family physician offices will be offering the vaccine. But I think we have to be aware that as you spread out the numerous sites that may be eligible, there will be a risk of wastage or very much a risk of queue jumping. And it's very important for all of these sites, if they're going to behave properly, to have opportunities for backup appointments or opportunities to minimize to zero the amount of wastage of vaccine dosages that they may have. There is concern about timely and fair access. You've already probably heard about system problems for online registration. Ontario is using the same system that has proven to be problematic in California. We desperately need a genuine offline process, which would be a phone and a human voice and not simply waiting on a phone for hours and hours. And there must be continued control over prioritization to prevent queue jumping. Special groups, for example, the elementary and secondary teachers, may actually require dedicated clinics to make sure that they are efficiently vaccinated in a timely fashion. This was a cartoon just from today. And finally, after many long days, the vaccines began to arrive and the people lived happily ever after, except in Ontario. Now, one thing is pretty apparent is that there will not be any choice of vaccines when you go to a particular site. And Ontario just today announced that it is now opening up the 60 to 64-year-old crowd for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which it will not be offering for people over the age of 65 and over. Now, fortunately, a couple of weeks ago, Ontario decided to prioritize 2 phase 1 seniors over 80 years of age. And there are 570,000 of those seniors, already not counting, by the way, the people in long-term care facilities, 120,000 of which are in Toronto. Now, at the same time, family physicians were told that they were going to have a role, but nobody has actually told them what their role is going to be, causing a fair amount of discomfort and dissension within the family medicine group. The next phase of the rollout, as you can see, phase 2, allegedly taking place over the next several months. The elderly, teachers, other so-called essential workers, not yet defined, unfortunately, and also the very tricky high-risk chronic conditions, again, not yet properly defined. And finally, in Ontario's phase 3, occurring over the summer into September, the remaining Ontarians. And even as late as last week, a shift in vaccine strategy suggesting that using postal codes and modified age restrictions, there may be a more efficient way of delivering vaccine to those areas, especially in parts of Toronto that are very much at high risk. Now, I've done some work trying to figure out how quickly we might be able to get the vaccines into people's arms. In Ontario, we have about 12 million people that are over 18 years of age. And at the end of December, Rick Hillier suggested that we could be aiming for 150 vaccinations per day. Colin Furness, one of the lead epidemiologists at the University of Toronto, a few days later suggested that maybe that number is more realistically going to be 100,000 doses per day. And we might even assume some kind of vaccine hesitancy rate to mean that the total population needed to vaccinate is just under 10 million. If we look at the population experience in 2 other major countries, the United States of America, with a population of 328 million, is now averaging well over 1.7 million vaccines per day. It is using the National Guard and the military to help, as well as having multiple major pharmacy chains distributing the vaccine. The United Kingdom, with a population of 66 million, is doing 300,000 per day. And on one day at the end of January, actually vaccinated almost 600,000 people on one day. They promised and they delivered that by the 15th of February, 15 million residents of the United Kingdom were vaccinated, representing 25% of the population. It's now just over 30% in the next couple of weeks. So if we look at those numbers and sort of do an approximate comparison to Ontario's population of the United States, using the American numbers, we should be able to produce 50,000 per day as a minimum. If we compared ourselves to the United Kingdom, 68,000 per day. If we believed General Hillier, 150 per day, and Colin Furness at the U of T, 100 per day. So my personal guesstimate, with no particular scientific basis, is let's assume that we can do 75,000 vaccinations per day. Now, at this particular point, as of the last couple of days, our first day over 20,000 was just last week. And today the number was 27,000. Now, we know from experience earlier that both a major university health network and Sunnybrook sites have been able to accomplish, on average, 1,000 patients per day. The 9 Toronto large community sites slated to open in April of 2021, working 12 hours per day, 7 days a week, are projecting 17,000 per day. The Peel region 6 sites, again opening in April, 17,600 per day, assuming that they're going to be able to get sufficient staffing and that they're efficient. So if one looks at the various dates proposed by government and looks at the age cohorts in one column, and you can see the number beside the age cohorts, there are 1.218 million Ontarians between the ages of 75 and 79. It would take only 16 days, if things were 100% accepted and 100% efficient, to vaccinate that entire cohort, using 75,000 per day as the guesstimate. And likewise, if we continue on to the next cohort, 70 to 74, 1.786 million to 28 days or 24 days. And finally, the cohort 65 to 69, 2.167 million, it would take 28 days. So ironically, without doing the calculations backward, using 75,000 per day actually approximates the timeline that the ministry has put out for these various cohorts to be vaccinated. So this slide attempts to summarize some of the lessons learned globally with respect to vaccines and vaccine rollout. First of all, spend big, get lots, and get it quickly. The American dollar, Israel, and the United States itself. Produce your own vaccine, as is done in the United Kingdom and the United States. Have an integrated healthcare system. Involve family physicians. Success decreases vaccine hesitancy, as has been nicely shown in Israel. One dose benefits seniors, as has been shown both in Israel and increasingly optimistic data coming from the UK. A good rollout decreases mortality, that has already been shown in Israel. And good herd immunity results are waited desperately from Israel and from other locations. Now, what about children? Surprisingly, in the United States, 24% of the American population is aged between 0 and 18. That percentage is only slightly smaller, 21% in Canada. In the United States, there were only 250 COVID deaths among people less than 18 years of age, as compared to today's number of 529,000 COVID deaths amongst adults. The young are felt to be very poor virus transmitters, but unfortunately, the 12 to 18-year-olds are felt to be actually good virus transmitters. And there are studies now underway in younger patients, both by Pfizer and Moderna, to see whether they can handle vaccinations. Because older children, unfortunately, will need to contribute to herd immunity. And there are concerns about what some have labeled parental proxy vaccine hesitancy. Because when you're dealing with a 12, 13, 14-year-old, it's the parent that has a significant say in terms of whether the child will have the vaccine or not. And the headline from a couple of days ago indicates that right now in Ontario, we still have significant concerns about measles vaccine rates. And if that's any indication of the hesitancy we may have about COVID vaccinations for younger children, that will be a problem for us. Now, I want to start concluding with the future with COVID-19 and the variants and how the vaccines will play a role in this. There are significant vaccine unrolls. We really don't yet know how long immunity will last. We really don't know whether vaccines protect against transmission. In other words, us as a vaccinated individual transmitting to somebody who isn't vaccinated. We don't know how well new mutations will be dealt with, and we're having studies underway with regard to vaccines used in children. So the vaccine has arrived, but the major question that we will have to confront very soon as a society is, have we achieved so-called herd or population immunity? It's the point in time when virus transmission is significantly delayed. And this is actually calculated using numbers by the public health authorities. It is not just an absolute percentage number. Anthony Fauci in the United States has estimated that we may need to aim for something like 85% of the population to get herd immunity, largely depending upon the effectiveness of the vaccines and the higher percentage needed because of current and future variants. We are awaiting results of the Israeli study to demonstrate the population needed to achieve herd immunity, but it's important to realize that we can't just take their percentage and transfer it to other countries because we have a different mix of variants already circulating in each country. So this graphic tries to emphasize where we need to be. So the red indicates that we must be getting somewhere between 70 and as high as 80% vaccinated, 85% vaccinated. In Canada right now, that number is 5.3%. In the lower corner, we have in the green pie, adults waiting to be vaccinated and children. And in the blue, some people will never actually be vaccinated. So what will happen if no herd immunity is achieved? We may need to see the continuation of social distancing, masking, opportunities denied to cinema, theater, opera, ballet, arena sports, large social gatherings, no travel outside of Canada, and foreign countries denying entry to Canadians. Or the immunity passport. The immunity passport would allow passport holders to dine at restaurants with large groups, to attend the cinema, the theater, the opera, the ballet, sporting events, to board airlines. And the asterisk indicates that all of these are private enterprises that have no obligation legally to accept your business. The immunity passport would allow you to visit foreign countries. And the immunity passport, as of yesterday, is being actively considered by the European Union. And as of right now, in case you happen to be a Muslim and want to go to the Hajj for Saudi Arabia, you need immunity proof. On the right-hand side of the slide, there is no doubt that this particular issue will very quickly reach the highest courts in the land, and there is a very little doubt that the public good will override any individual rights issues. And just as a reminder, for all of us on this call who have a passport today, remember what a current passport allows us to do. It allows us to enter countries, but those countries make their own rules in terms of who they want to admit. And there are already multiple extra rules, such as visa requirements beyond the passport. If you want to go to China, if you want to go to Tibet, if you want to go to Russia, you need more than just a passport. And there are many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where you need, for example, proof of yellow fever vaccination. So the concept of having some kind of vaccine passport for COVID-19 is not terribly far-fetched, and it likely will be a reality country by country, depending upon herd immunity. Now, the other point that I want to make is you have been vaccinated, but unlike the numbers that we're tossing around, 75%, 95%, 62%, when you get vaccinated, your vaccine effectiveness is either 100% or 0%. And if you are 0%, in other words, if you have not reacted by creating an immune response, you are still going to be susceptible to potentially anything along the spectrum from a mild infection to hopefully not a severe infection. So it's very important to remember that you're not going to be 95 or 92 or 75% affected. For you as an individual, you'll be 100 or you'll be 0. And within that 0, hopefully, there will be a spectrum that if you do encounter coronavirus, you will get a mild as opposed to a serious infection. I've been vaccinated, but can I visit others who have been vaccinated? And the current advice is likely going to be that yes, you can interact with younger people 2 weeks after their vaccination, but likely many more up to 3 months for seniors, because seniors have a poorer and a later virus response, vaccine response. Can I visit others who have not been vaccinated? Likely no, because again, you may be able to transmit virus unknowingly, even though you've been vaccinated. Pending study results, this may change, but that's going to be the current advice. And so, as we discussed even last November, there will still be some need, even with vaccination, for individual risk assessment. Should you be more careful because of your age, if you're immunocompromised, if you are medically vulnerable for some reason? Individual risk assessment, are you going to be willing to sacrifice some social interactions to continue wearing a mask? Will virtual meetings such as this be sufficient for your social needs or for your professional needs? Or in fact, will we be entering a hybrid reality where you will be given a choice of an in-person gathering or a concomitant associated virtual opportunity on the side? And after the pandemic, we likely will enter what is called an endemic. And currently, we are in an endemic for influenza A and for 4 common cold coronaviruses. Influenza A is a direct descendant of the Spanish flu from 1918. Yearly, before COVID, it killed 650,000 individuals globally per year. In Canada, that number was about 4,000. In the United States, 35,000. And that's why the influenza vaccine, which is notorious for mutating, requires annual vaccinations. We can easily see the coronavirus becoming endemic and requiring some kind of frequent revaccination. And my last official slide, the return to normal in this cartoon is going to likely be a bit of an up and down. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Thank you for your listening, and I look forward to discussion and answering any questions that I might be able to answer in the next while. Thank you all so very much. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Peter. It was really very exciting. But why did I? Oh, we are seeing Maya's screen now. I can't see the comments. What type of masks do you currently recommend? I have lost faith in cloth masks, looking into KN95.
Okay, so as I mentioned, even last November, the problem with the N95 mask is that to be worn properly, it has to be professionally fitted to you. It's not a mask that can just be bought off the shelf, because in hospital settings, for example, every year we have to get what's called an N95 mask fit test. And so I'm very leery of the off-the-shelf approach, because it's probably not going to fit you properly unless you go through what's usually about a 15 to 20-minute procedure to have it properly fit. So right now, there are, of course, lots of recommendations about double masking. My personal experience with double masking is that that can actually be very difficult to breathe. And so I think that for practical purposes, the regular surgical masks or any other kind of properly constructed cloth mask will have to do. If you feel particularly vulnerable, you can try double masking, but the problem with double masking is that if you're not able to breathe, you're going to start cheating and taking that mask off.
Great clear talk, thanks, ütleb Ants Toi. Suur tänu, Peeter, väga hea. Have there been any cases of people who were vaccinated that got COVID?
There will be. I'm aware that there may already be a couple of reports. I've heard rumors that there may have been a report in Estonia, but invariably that will happen as we have more individuals. Now, hopefully that will happen with someone who gets a relatively mild case of COVID. We may, unfortunately, have a situation or two developing in the media where somebody got properly vaccinated and because of some underlying condition may actually die of COVID. But it invariably will happen because, as that slide showed, your own individual effectiveness from a vaccine is going to be 0 or 100. It won't be anywhere in between.
What type of vaccine certification are people receiving as they receive vaccinations?
Well, I can only speak from the experience of two individuals in my household. Right now, it's pretty shoddy, but at least they seem to have some kind of official Ministry of Health proof that they've been vaccinated. What I think will ultimately happen if we have to revert to some kind of immunity passport is that there will have to be a national database that will allow someone to be properly proven to have vaccination. Anything short of that, any kind of piece of paper, will be easily, readily, and very expensively counterfeited. So the whole issue of the technical aspects of any kind of passport will have to essentially be as secure in some way or other as our current real Canadian and EU passports are. Even those, of course, are counterfeitable. But my suspicion is that it will require national databases as well as some kind of robust form that cannot easily be counterfeited, although there will be undoubtedly an industry for that. And you'll remember back in the first wave, there was an industry of these phony medically exempt cards that were popping up all over the place.
So you said that people with allergies should not be vaccinated. Do you mean allergies specifically to vaccines or this specific vaccine?
Well, it won't be to this vaccine, although of course, if you've had a reaction to the first one, you're going to be in trouble for the second one. But I think what's meant by severe allergic reactions is, first of all, to any previous vaccine, because there are some shared ingredients, as well as if you have, for example, severe allergies, allergic reactions to things like wasp and bee stings. I think that the recommendation currently is that you seek the advice of your family physician and or an immunologist to see what chance you should be taking. And that's why I emphasize the role of bamlanivimab, because it may be possible that if you have a genuine concern about getting vaccinated, you may at some point be eligible for that intravenous injection of bamlanivimab as opposed to taking the risk of vaccines. But so far, in the hundreds of thousands of people that have been vaccinated, there have been, fortunately, relatively few serious reactions. And ironically, the first two serious reactions were within the first day in the United Kingdom for people who already had EpiPens with them, which means that they had some kind of serious allergic reaction in their past.
Certain physicians, for example, Dr. Risch of Yale, recommending hydroxychloroquine, and other physicians recommending ivermectin, have assembled impressive collections of research and argue that these are preventatives and means of early outpatient treatment are safe and effective. What is your opinion?
So I've read the studies on ivermectin. Ivermectin is an antifungal used in animals largely. And quite frankly, and this applies to all of the non-traditional approaches, it is a language that I do not understand. And I'm not going to spend any time trying to debate the benefits of medications that are advocated by some people, presumably with some sincerity. But all you have to do is reflect back on one of the famous physicians from the last year, Dr. Donald J. Trump, who also had lots of advice about all sorts of things, including inhaled Lysol to help. So unfortunately, there is a large world out there of various attempts at preventing or treating COVID, which have not yet reached the level of what my training provided me as what one call conventional or traditional medical language. And so it's a language I simply don't understand.
There are some more thank yous from Kai, and Thomas is asking, what is your forecast for the future? When will we be able to walk around without masks? When can we go to Estonia? That's exactly what I was going to ask you.
Well, as I mentioned toward the end, first of all, it may be up to Estonia. It may be up to the EU. And if they decide to target Canada because we have not reached herd immunity, it'll be up to them to determine whether we have a robust enough personal immunity passport to allow us to travel to those countries. That, I think, is the most compelling example. And the EU, as of yesterday, is actively considering having some kind of passport system, not only for their own citizens, but of course for people coming to visit. With respect to gathering without masks, I'm somewhat pessimistic, and I'm really very uncertain as to whether we will be able to achieve enough internal immunity. Now, if we also impose some kind of COVID internal immunity passport on ourselves, I could see gatherings where people have to show the passport. But that becomes very awkward from the point of trying to organize and having somebody at the door saying, show me your immunity passport, and you're going to be able to get in and you're not. Because we realize that there is a fairly substantial minority of individuals who will not get the vaccine. And so that's going to be as much of a social dynamic problem as a medical problem. That's the best I can do to try to answer that one, Thomas.
Anstoy says that he got his certificate in email immediately after vaccination. They have my online record. My employer asked for a copy of this e-version.
Right, and we've, I think that's after the second dose, because my two family members have only had their first dose, and all they got was a Ministry of Health printout, which has been scanned for whatever purpose. But ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever paper document you have is going to be counterfeitable. So at the end of the day, as I suggested earlier, there's going to have to be some kind of backup national database that will allow somebody at the Estonian border to let Dr. Anstoy in above and beyond whatever paper or other electronic device he may have, just because of the issue of counterfeiting. But at least we're starting, and there is a database that's fortunately being maintained robustly.
Maya says, my granddaughter had COVID 4 weeks ago, a mild case. She's fine now. Should I keep a distance? She's 26.
If she, presumably Maya is not yet vaccinated, so I would certainly continue to keep distance. When she does get vaccinated as presumably an older person, remember that the older person is going to take several weeks or maybe even months to mount the appropriate immune response. That's going to be a real big challenge, because that'll be a question that will come up almost immediately. As older people get the vaccine, they're going to say, I'm going to now start seeing my kids, my grandkids, but they haven't been vaccinated yet, and they are transmitters unless they're really, really young.
Marianne, you mentioned that the 60 to 64-year-olds may be eligible for the AstraZeneca vaccine. Is this in March or further down the road?
Oh, it's almost definitely going to be in March, because the AstraZeneca that we acquired has an expiry date on April the 2nd.
Okay.
So there's going to be a very interesting push between now and April the 2nd to get somehow that 60 to 64 cohort in Ontario to get the AZ product. This just came out today with the expiry date. And so it's going to be a really interesting aspect of the rollout to see how they pull that one off.
Great talk. Vets are filling in here in Quebec in vaccination centers. Creativity. Also, media report today that the 60s age group may be in line more quickly than expected, perhaps March. The same question.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if Ontario seriously adopts the delayed second dose model, which other provinces, Quebec, British Columbia especially, have done. British Columbia, by the way, I emphasize British Columbia because it's had a very, very strong reputation in epidemiology. Danuta Skorowski, who I quoted before, has been a renowned Canadian epidemiologist since at least the time of SARS. So that a lot of what BC is doing is actually informed by great expertise. Ontario has significant expertise itself, but we have a government that has been unwilling to respond to our epidemiologic expertise. Quebec has been much better. As I emphasized before, Quebec has done a better job of earlier vaccinating its long-term care residents. In Ontario, we started with PSWs. In Quebec, their first vaccinations went into elderly long-term care patient people. And as I mentioned before, the Quebec government also did a tremendous job of hiring and training new PSWs over the course of the summer, so they don't have the same staffing problems that are still befuddling us in Ontario. So we have a lot to learn, not only from Israel, not only from the UK, not only from the US, but also from our neighboring provinces like Quebec and British Columbia. All we have to do is learn and listen and do.
Yeah, Anstoy is asking if this lecture would be available later online. Yes.
Yeah.
It would be on Vemo YouTube channel,
Mm-hmm.
and probably even tomorrow, if we don't have to edit or there are no technical issues.
Hopefully not. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Jaanus and Reet, in Estonia, my relatives have had antibody levels measured. Is that occurring here? And if no, why not?
It is not occurring here except in the context of research studies. First of all, the reason is they are expensive to do, and they really don't give a lot of information other than to say that sometime in the past, you may have had some exposure. But the quantification of the level is actually very unhelpful. There was a lot of work done with antibody measurements, for example, in the Southern United States. Los Angeles did a lot of work in that regard. And at a practical level, it is not terribly useful because it's not going to really change what you do. If I knew that I had an antibody level, it wouldn't give me direction as to whether I wanted to get vaccinated or not. So for a variety of reasons, expense and not providing useful information, it's not available. Having said that, in private enterprise, I know that you can go to some of the private clinics and for $250 or $300, get an antibody level. But what you do with that information for practical purposes is not terribly useful.
Thomas Marley, Peter, have you been vaccinated? How much does a flight to United Arab Emirates cost?
So the flight to the Emirates, because we actually did that flight, is the business class 8,000 Canadian dollars. I have not been vaccinated because I'm a retired physician and I will be waiting my turn in the 65 and over cohort. I feel very strongly that I am not going to pull any kind of special privileges at Sunnybrook, despite the fact that I'm still on staff there, because I don't think that I deserve the vaccine until it's my turn as a citizen.
So the next comes from Val. Have trouble understanding why the Ontario portal for vaccine registration will not be ready until March 15. We knew we would need one.
Well, that's an interesting political question, and I could be very cynical and say that we should have been planning for this portal from about April of last year. I don't have any excuse to offer or any rational reason to offer as to why we are so late in preparing the portal. So your guess is as good as mine, unfortunately. And I think it's going to be a tremendous black mark against our ministry, especially if on March the 15th, the system crashes as it did in California. They're using the same system as they used in California. We've already seen examples this week of hospital systems, including my own hospital, Sunnybrook, was able to register 12,000 individuals in about 2 hours before it crashed. And I know that Sunnybrook has a very, very robust IT team. So I dread what's going to happen on the 15th of March. I hope somehow they have learned, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. And I hate to be so negative about that one, but it is one of the significant rollout fumbles that we have already seen. And of course, what will happen, by the way, is that all of these local systems will then not function. So once March the 15th comes along, the Sunnybrook system, the St. Michael's system, the UHN system, any other systems that you're hearing about right now will cease to operate. And everything will have to be funneled through the main Ministry of Health portal, so help us.
First, Thomas is pleased with your answer. And Matis Krem is asking, if university students and professors get vaccinated before September, do you think in-class university will begin in the fall?
That's an interesting question, Matis. Again, it would depend upon where we are with respect to the herd. And in addition, it would depend on what kind of classes. So classes that will require in-person activities, such as labs, may well take a chance. I think what you're going to find, though, is that a lot of people, despite what we want to admit, have become comfortable with some of the online methods for a variety of reasons: transportation costs, laundry costs, et cetera, et cetera. And so you may find a hybrid or a patchwork of some things being offered online for everyone and others that are being given in person. And of course, professors will be age dependent. There will be no special recognition for university professors. When I talk about teachers, it is elementary and secondary school teachers that may be prioritized early. There's been no discussion whatsoever of university professors having early access to the vaccine. They're going to have to go by age.
I will ask the same question I asked you last time. When it's a good time for the next Estonia Music Week?
I would cautiously say I wouldn't do much planning for this particular year. We might get lucky for 2022. Because I have serious reservations about our capacity to do herd immunity unless we end up with a passport system and somebody at the door is not only going to be collecting the admission ticket, but will be checking the national database to make sure that you were legitimately vaccinated. I'm only trying to be as truthful as I possibly can be on this one. And I'd be glad if I end up being wrong on that one.
Yeah, I was afraid that's what I hoped to hear or was afraid to hear. I have also a question. In Estonia, they are analyzing this reovesi or the wastewater to try to predict what are the numbers for the cases. And those are now predicting really bad situation for Estonia in like a couple of weeks. Are Canada doing anything like this?
Yeah, we are indeed. So sewage is a very useful way of detecting a wide variety of illnesses, including antibiotic use and opioid use, for example. I've studied to see how much opioid use there is illicitly in the population. So the same kind of studies are done with COVID. And one of the interesting things about those studies is that our current case counts are widely anticipated to be underestimating the true incidence of COVID in the population. So yes, indeed, we have the same kinds of sewer wastewater studies that are undergoing for various research reasons such as that.
I don't see any questions here. Do you have? When you spoke of immunity passports, did you just mean vaccination passports, or does this also, I have to go to the, does it also depend on herd immunity in Canada?
No, if we're talking about a true immunity passport, it would be directly related to vaccination, not even to infection. So it's important to understand that if you've had a COVID infection, a genuine infection, your immunity is unlikely to be very long lasting. And so that's why patients who have had COVID are eligible for the vaccine. It's very important to realize that unlike certain diseases that we have, having had exposure to COVID does not prevent you from getting it a second time. And there have been numerous cases already prior to the world of vaccines when people have had a second legitimate COVID infection. So when the passport comes along, if we ever need that, it will be individual to your personal status as a passport holder. Now, unfortunately, that does not stop any country in the world from basically painting an entire other country with the black tar brush. So even if you, as a Canadian citizen, happen to have an immunity passport, the EU, as an example, may still say, we don't want to have anybody from Canada coming in. And that's the geopolitical reality that we have to deal with, just as we have for the last while, because every country, as you can imagine, is desperately interested in protecting itself from a third wave or a fourth wave. And as that slide that I showed with the New York variant, let's not fool ourselves. We can predict that there will be additional waves of variants coming day after day, week after week, even month after month. And that's why the New York variant discovered just last week is the first of the next one and the next one after that and the next one after the next one after that. That's the undoubted reality of this particular kind of virus. And so countries may well be very, very cautious if they've done well in prohibiting entry to entire populations. Or they may take a more selective approach and say, if you've got it, that's good. And so, for example, from a marketing point of view, if you were a major tourist site like Cuba or some other Caribbean country, it would be to your marketing advantage to advertise that you only accept COVID immune patients, because that would make you safer, very much like those airlines in the United States that abandoned the middle seats, purported themselves from a marketing point of view to be safer to fly. It may not be true, but it can easily imagine that will be a marketing ploy in the future.
A question from Paul Lanemets. Have there been improvements in contact tracing? I remember last year stats were showing almost half of cases, the source remained unknown.
So the simple answer to that is yes, but the reason for that has been, first of all, there has been a modest increase in the number of contact tracers. Just about a month ago, I, as a retired physician, got an offer to be a contact tracer. So they have had a little bit of uptake. But the most important feature is that the total number of cases that we're dealing with on a daily basis has gone down. And so that's allowed more efficient contact tracing because a few more people have been hired, but a lot more cases have to be traced.
Question from Val. Do you think the American border will remain closed all year?
That's an interesting one. I mean, the Americans remarkably are doing extremely well from the vaccination point of view. But remember that being vaccinated will provide protection from you as a vaccinated person getting the virus. It does not necessarily protect you from transmitting the virus. And of course, from a political point of view, the big question is, of those 72 million American adults who voted for the former president, how many of them will be vaccine deniers? So that's a very, if you think about that pie that I showed with that little blue quadrant of never going to be vaccinated, one would hate to imagine that some significant part of those 72 million adults and their children, who they will have influence over, if they don't get vaccinated, the Americans will have a hard time achieving herd immunity. And we may be concerned about that even if we get herd immunity on both a national and a sort of an individual level.
There is another question from Annelies concerning US. We own a house in Florida. My husband flew to Florida to get our AC repaired and has had both doses of the Pfizer vaccine at no cost since we own property there.
That's
I'm
correct.
truly conflicted. Should I fly down since I will need to wait till June and then 4 months later for second dose? I could then also visit my daughter, her husband and grandson in the US, who I haven't been able to see for over a year.
Well, I can't give that kind of personal advice on Ellie, but obviously you know the parameters, and assuming that you're not going to be coming back by plane, you won't have to go through the indignities of the quarantine hotels that are surrounding the airport. I mean, certainly ownership in the United States in Florida does allow you to pay for the vaccine. The one concern that hasn't been raised yet is making sure that any proof of American vaccination is somehow legitimately transferable to the Canadian database, or one might get some future immunity issues associated with that. So without getting personal about your own circumstance, that's another sort of a little fly in the ointment to be concerned about.
I'm an anesthetist, sorry, my Stonglish, in
Mhm.
the Scarborough Hospital network. A year ago, we expected to end up like Italy, getting infected one at a time. However, with basis PPE and triage of patients in the OR, there have so far been no infected colleagues or patients. Most of us have been fully vaccinated. I went through SARS-1 in 2003 as both physician and a patient. My hospital Scarborough race was Canadian ground zero.
Oh yes, I reported on that back in November, and that must be Allan that's making that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Certainly, we have been very fortunate in Canada with respect to physicians and COVID-19. Many of you will be aware that there was a young Quebec physician who died of suicide as a result of presumed COVID stress. But to the best of my knowledge, unless I've missed something, at least in Ontario, there has not been a physician COVID-related death. Now, unfortunately, one of my classmates died of COVID in Arizona. He practiced obstetrics and gynecology in Arizona. And of my 250 classmates from the University of Toronto, he's the only one that has passed away of COVID, but he was in a very hot area, hot from the point of view, not only the temperature, but of the infection at a time when he passed away. But Canadian physicians as a group have been very fortunate in being able to be wise to the appropriate precautions, and touch wood, have not had any serious consequences as a result of that.
Anneli says that vaccination in Florida is at no cost to recipient.
That's because Ron DeSantis is a good Republican, and it's recognizing that greatest generation of the US. So I guess as long as you're a resident and you're paying taxes, that's basically sufficient. I know that prior to the documentation requirement for residency, in other words, before January the 21st, one of the largest groups receiving vaccinations in Florida was the rich from South America. And they were paying quite a considerable sum for their vaccine. So certainly having been paying taxes in Florida would put you into that freebie category.
And Thomas Marley said again, thanks to Peter, but also to Vemu and team. So thank you, Thomas, for saying thanks. And I think that's a proper time to remind that Vemu Estonian Studies Center actually is accepting some voluntary donations, which you can do if you go to our webpage or the Facebook event page through Canada Helps. And that would help us to put our program together for you in this strange COVID time, because it seems that we have to stay online. There is no way we can meet.
I would echo that, by the way, in terms of considering a donation to Vemu. It's a very important cause for the future that we're all hoping to visit.
And Antoi says, if you have a doctor's appointment, please keep it and don't be a no-show and prevent another patient from attending. Also, if you need to see a doctor, don't delay. We are seeing patients waiting too long and as a result present with advanced problems. Look after your general health as needed.
Yeah, very good advice. And you'll recall from my November the 18th presentation that we know that above and beyond COVID, there has been, unfortunately, an increased mortality in the United States and in Canada, largely because of what Dr. Toy was talking about, the failure to early diagnose conditions that could have been treated earlier had people not been afraid of going to hospital. So it's a great reminder. Thanks for saying that. And there is data to support the fact that is actually occurring. It's not just speculation, it's very real. And of course, the young lady in Quebec, the actress in Quebec that I featured on one of my slides, is a classic example of what happens when you don't have hospital resources that she would have needed for a major operation and was denied to her and unfortunately died as a result.
And again, Peeter, suur tänu. Really, very interesting, very exciting, very clear, well informed. So we probably need to have a next lecture in a couple of months.
Well, hopefully not in a couple of months, but I'm more than willing to try to help the cause.
Okay, and thanks everyone for joining. So that if your family members, friends didn't see that, tell them that the lecture would be available on PEMU YouTube channel pretty soon. And stay safe, be healthy, and we'll see you on Zoom or Facebook or somewhere in this cosmos.
Take care, everybody. Thank you very much for your attention, for your discussion, and for your questions.
Good night.
Thanks, Peter. Fantastic.